Welcome, everybody, to another masterclass here at Mind for All Seasons. Today, we're talking about the science of omega-3 fatty acids. And we'll talk not only about fish and consuming fish, but we'll also focus mainly on fish oil and fish oil supplements because they've been in the news a lot for the last several years. And today, one of my goals is to help you separate fact from fiction and figure out what is marketing hype versus real science. What is just a headline meant to get attention and to promote eyeballs to look at something versus what is a research study actually saying? In my experience over the last few years, the science of omega-3 fatty acids has caused a lot of headlines that are sort of bipolar. It's kind of like when I was growing up and people kept arguing over whether eggs were good or eggs were bad. One minute it seems like they're good, and the next minute the headlines were about how bad they are for you. And we're getting a lot of similar kinds of headlines as it relates to fish oil. So I thought it might be valuable to everybody to break those things down and explore what the studies are telling us and what they're not telling us. One of the things that really ignited people's interest in using omega-3 fatty acids in the context of brain health was an experience in 2006. The Sago mine in West Virginia collapsed and trapped a bunch of miners underground for about 40 hours. By the time rescuers got to those individuals, all but one were dead. The one who was alive had multiple organ system damage, and he had a hypoxic brain injury. He'd been exposed to carbon monoxide gas for many, many hours, and he was not expected to make it. His name was Randall McCloy Jr., and he was carted off to a local emergency department where doctors hooked up a bunch of machines and did their evaluations, but they were also preparing the family for the worst. And then his neurosurgeon, Dr. Julian Bales, reached out to Dr. Barry Sears for a consult and to get his opinion. And Dr. Sears recommended doing something that was novel. And to my knowledge, it hadn't been tried before in any sort of a traumatic brain injury kind of a situation. Dr. Sears told Dr. Bales to use high-dose fish oil, to use a combined total of DHA and EPA that sometimes was like 19 milligrams a day. That meant that they were pushing a whole lot of fish oil through a feeding tube into Randall McCloy Jr. Well, it wasn't very long before this man, who wasn't even expected to make it, and who was expected, if he did make it, to have very long-lasting brain injury side effects, he walked out of the hospital. You see a picture here on the left of Randall McCloy Jr. with his father walking out of the hospital. And the other shot is of him in an Associated Press interview talking about the experience of being trapped underground. That experience ignited a whole lot of interest in the possibility of using omega-3 fatty acids for treating traumatic brain injuries. And it was followed up by other kinds of experiences. So let's talk about Grant Virgin. Maybe you've heard of JJ Virgin, who's a noted health influencer. Her son had a terrible accident. And there's a CNN interview that you can still find on YouTube with Dr. Sanjay Gupta talking to the Virgins about Grant's case. Now, I can't download that video, but I want to share it with you so that you can see it. So this is coming courtesy of CNN, and let's just see what they have to say. It's about 4 minutes long.
Grant Virgin's family knew only a few details about his accident. A white car, a hit and run, a teenager airlifted from a bloody scene, nearly dead. They rushed to the hospital to find out if he was still alive.
It was a tough scene when we got there.
The doctor had a really bad look on his face.
That look was a reflection of Grant's injuries. They were staggering.
He had a torn aorta, multiple brain bleeds, a broken wrist, a broken elbow. Both his femurs were fractured.
His ER doctor told Grant's family to let him go.
The fact that this doctor wasn't fighting for his life just blew my mind. He's not dead yet. Why would you just, as a parent, how could you ever let go, not knowing that you hadn't done every single possible thing that you could for your son?
Doing every single possible thing was going to take Grant's family on a wild journey, full of twists and turns, and some unconventional therapies. 2 weeks after his accident, after several operations, Grant was in a coma. His heart was okay, his brain was not.
The doctor told me, she goes, okay, now we wait. Surely there's something we could do. She goes, nope, nothing we can do. We just wait. You know, the brain's got its own time schedule.
In what would become a theme, impatient, Grant's family swept aside that doctor's advice. First, they tried progesterone. That's a hormone that, according to early studies, may reduce inflammation in the brain. Soon afterward, his family says Grant began to speak.
He'd say, let's go. He'd say, I want to go home. But he really just brief little, like, yes, no type of things, not big, long explanations of anything.
Then Grant's mother got an email with a link to this story.
He never would have come out of a coma if it hadn't been for the use of omega-3s.
The CNN story was about high-dose omega-3s found in fish oil and how it may have played a healing role in cases of traumatic brain injury. During a traumatic brain injury, the brain swells and nerve cells stop communicating and die. Omega-3 fatty acids, the theory goes, can do 3 very important things: rebuild damaged nerve cells, reduce inflammation, keep those brain cells from dying. An analogy from one expert, a metaphorical fire being put out in the brain. The science is not clear. There have been no large studies, and it didn't always seem to work. But despite that, Grant Virgin's family, a combination of desperate and determined, decided to give it a try.
I don't want to wait 20 years while they do a bunch more studies to prove that it really works. I don't need that.
Grant was given 20 grams of fish oil per day through his feeding tube, even more than Randy McCloy got. In December of 2012, 9 weeks after his accident and only 2 days after starting high-dose fish oil therapy, Grant Virgin made a phone call.
And I wake up the next morning and I went, did Grant call me and did we have a whole conversation? I just remember going, I must have dreamed that. That couldn't have possibly happened.
But it did happen.
It was unbelievable. And a couple days into giving him the fish oil, he is now talking in sentences.
In time, Grant became more animated, and soon he was walking.
Yeah, we'll do it starting with January.
January, February, March.
Here is Grant, a year after nearly dying, a year after his family was told to let him go. He is doing everything doctors said he wouldn't.
Straight up.
Why do some people never recover, and some go on to look like this? We don't know for sure, but his parents believe something as simple as fish oil is a big reason why.
It's amazing. I mean, okay, what if it didn't do anything? It certainly couldn't hurt. Or what if you have this kind of result?
Dr. Sanjay Gupta, CNN, reporting.
Isn't that interesting and impressive? I think it's quite a testament to the possibilities of high-dose fish oil. And I misspoke earlier. I talked about Randall McCloy, and I think I said 19 milligrams. It's 19 grams, 19,000 milligrams. That's a lot of fish oil. And in Grant's case, they used 20 grams. So what about some of the more recent studies that call into question aspects about fish oil? Maybe you saw this study from 2024 from the British Medical Journal, where they said regular use of fish oil supplements might be a risk factor for atrial fibrillation and stroke among the general population. Well, that sounds pretty scary. And there were all sorts of headlines that were saying, whoa, taking fish oil might not be such a good thing because it might increase the risk of atrial fibrillation. When you see a headline like that, if you're taking a fish oil supplement, it can be kind of scary. And you might think, oh my goodness, am I doing damage to my heart? Am I causing atrial fibrillation? And I've had members of A Mind for All Seasons ask questions like that. But when you look at the research itself and you start asking, what were they really studying and how did they study it? What you find is that in this study, they simply asked people on a questionnaire if they used fish oil. and then they looked at rates of atrial fibrillation. What they didn't take into account is the fact that many people with heart disease are told to take fish oil, and they have been for many years because it's been thought to be helpful in heart disease. And so if you have a sample of the population that already has heart disease, and they're more likely to be taking fish oil than the general population, then you're likely to see higher rates of atrial fibrillation. This is a classic case of correlation does not equal causation. Now, very interestingly, some other researchers decided to study the question in a little bit more fine-tuned way. Instead of just asking, do people on a frequency questionnaire who are taking a lot of fish oil have higher rates of atrial fibrillation, they asked the question, do people with higher blood levels of omega-3 fatty acids have a difference in the rate of atrial fibrillation? So instead of actually measuring omega-3 status in the body, the first study was just using a yes-no questionnaire. Well, when you go to the study where they actually measured the plasma level of omega-3 fatty acids, what you find is that those with the highest levels of omega-3 fatty acids had a much lower risk of atrial fibrillation. When you go into people and you actually measure what's in the blood, you get the complete opposite result because you're actually asking a different question. So this study used 261,000 adults from the UK Biobank where they actually had omega-3 measurements available. And these were adults that didn't have atrial fibrillation at the beginning of the study. And they found that those who had the highest number of total omega-3s had a 14% lower risk of atrial fibrillation. And if people had the highest levels of overall omega-3s, they were linked to a 16% lower risk compared to the lowest levels. This underscores why it's so important to know what is being actually studied, what kinds of questions are being asked, how are the studies designed. It's interesting that now we know from this larger study that the more omega-3s are in your blood, the lower your risk of atrial fibrillation. Well, a researcher in the military went to the blood bank of soldiers who had committed suicide and actually looked at blood samples and asked, what were the omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratios in soldiers who committed suicide? Where their blood was collected in this blood bank for further research to try to figure out what is contributing to soldiers who take their own lives. And in that research, he found that the average omega-6-3 ratio in soldiers who suicided was 25-1. That's pretty staggering considering that it's thought that you need to have a 4-1 ratio or lower. Ideal would be 1-1 because omega-6 fatty acids allow us to have inflammation and omega-3s help to calm inflammation. Omega-3s also make up about 30% of the structure of a brain cell, particularly DHA. The human brain is the fattest organ in the body. And if you look at the overall structure, it's about 60% fat. And 30% of those fats are DHA. So looking at somebody that has way too many omega-6 fatty acids and is therefore possibly in a really pro-inflammatory state might help explain why soldiers sometimes get to the point that their brain's working so poorly that they end up taking their own life. Now, there's a lot of additional work to be done to figure out causative factors, but it's really interesting to see what the data shows. Now, what about this recent research that showed earlier this year that EPA acid might actually hinder cellular recovery after a brain injury? And there were all sorts of headlines, there still are all sorts of headlines based on this research paper where the authors of the articles are saying fish oil might actually prevent brain injury recovery. Well, how are we to reconcile that with cases like Randall McCloy Jr. and cases like Grant Virgin and other similar kinds of cases? What about people right here in our own AmFast community who have personally told me, Eric, if I knew that a bottle of fish oil would make that big of a difference in my brain, I would have started a long time ago. That's been a common thing from some of the professional football players that we've worked with. How do you reconcile all of that? Well, let's consider the strengths of that research paper. If you actually look at what they're doing, you see that they studied things in several different ways. And a lot of the work was done looking at postmortem brain tissue. So people who donated their brains, they died, and the researchers went in and actually measured some things. And even more of the work in the study was done with mice, where they fed mice different diets, and then they inflicted mild traumatic brain injuries on those mice, and they looked at what was going on. So a strength of the study is that they had this whole mechanistic workup of complementary approaches. They were using animal models. They were using postmortem tissue of humans. They were also looking at cell cultures and exposing those cells to different fatty acids and seeing how they responded. That's a good thing. They're looking at the problem from a lot of different angles. They also use pretty careful measurements of fatty acids in the brain using things like mass spectrometry rather than just using dietary questionnaires, at least in the human subjects that they were looking at. They had a randomized dietary assignment in the mouse experiments. So they were able to infer a stronger possibility of causation as opposed to just correlation. Those are all good strengths. The authors also are looking at differences between DHA and EPA, two of the major omega-3 fatty acids. And that's a good thing because there's a lot that we don't know about how those fatty acids might work differently in the brain. So I love all that about the research. But I think the media reports and the headlines that are being spun out of control are just that. They are out of control. I think people are overreaching and saying too much about this research, and they're not acknowledging the limitations of the research. So what are they? Well, the primary evidence in this study comes from mice exposed to repetitive mild traumatic brain injuries, not humans with diverse forms of brain injury. There are a lot of different ways that you can injure your brain. If you're trapped under a mine like Randall McCloy Jr., that's a very different kind of injury to the brain than if you're in a pedestrian auto accident like Grant Virgin was. And yet in this study, not only were they not testing out different injuries on humans, because you can't exactly ethically sign people up and say, well, we're going to hurt you in different ways so that we can study it. That's obvious. But they took the mice and they did exactly the same kind of injury to those mice. So we're limited in what we can learn from that. The experimental diets are highly controlled in the mice. Lots and lots of their diet was coming from fatty acids, and that's not really mimicking a real-world situation in humans where they're taking fish oil. So we're a little bit limited in what we can infer from that. The human data involved in this trial was with postmortem tissue, and so it's just observational. It's not an interventional kind of trial where you're comparing an intervention against a placebo. And there was no information available about the humans whose brains were studied on autopsy and whether or not they ate a lot of fish or whether or not they were supplementing. We didn't know much about their blood omega-3 status or their genetics or other lifestyle factors. The only thing that they were able to look at was what was the composition of omega-3 fatty acids in the brain tissue of the brains that they studied. Brain EPA accumulation could plausibly be the result of impaired metabolism after injury rather than the cause of poor repair. So there's kind of a chicken and an egg sort of phenomenon going on here. Is it that the brain sent more EPA to those regions that were damaged in an attempt to try to repair it? Or was it that there was more EPA there and that hindered repair? We don't know. And the presence of higher levels of EPA doesn't tell us what the mechanism is. It's kind of like amyloid beta in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. We know that Alzheimer's patients have high levels of amyloid beta protein that builds up and forms sticky plaques. Some people for years have said, well, that's the cause and the symptom of Alzheimer's disease. And that's why there's been such effort to produce anti-amyloid medications. But other researchers like Dr. Dale Bredesen would argue, well, the presence of amyloid is actually evidence of the brain's innate immune system, and it's trying to heal the brain. So the real question is, why is the brain producing excess amyloid and failing to clear it? That might get us a little bit further. To give you a simpler example, everybody knows that when you get sick, your white blood cell count goes up. What if you mistook correlation for causation? What if you didn't know that elevated white blood cells is just evidence of the immune system all fired up? What if instead you just observed that every time somebody gets sick, their white cell count goes up? And so you design a drug to eliminate all those excess white blood cells. Well, based on the current knowledge that we have, that would probably kill more people because you'd be eliminating an important aspect of the body's immune response. That's the kind of thing that happens when we mistake correlation for causation, and we mistake the presence of something as being a mechanism. So I think it's a stretch to say conclusively that if you have higher levels of EPA in brain tissue, that it hinders cellular repair. I don't think we know that from this study. So overall, I'd say that the paper supports the idea that EPA, one of those omega-3 fatty acids, might be metabolized differently after a repetitive brain injury. And under certain experimental conditions, that this was associated with impaired ability to repair vasculature. What the study doesn't tell us is it doesn't establish that taking fish oil after a traumatic brain injury is harmful in humans. It doesn't justify abandoning the existing body of research on omega-3 fatty acids and their potential benefit. It just points toward a much more nuanced question. Like, could the balance of EPA and DHA and the timing of when you supplement with it and the brain's metabolic state determine whether omega-3s help or hinder in recovery? I like that a little bit more because there's a whole lot about the human body that is context dependent. There's a lot of research, for example, on eating dietary fat that seems to skew an idea toward, oh, fat's evil. And yet it's context dependent. For example, if you use food frequency questionnaires and you ask people about eating hamburger meat, then what you're not teasing out is the context in which they eat the hamburger. Eating a hamburger patty sandwiched between a couple of ultra-processed pieces of bread, the standard bun, and a whole lot of condiments that have a bunch of high fructose corn syrup on them, that is a completely different context than eating a hamburger patty by itself or in a bowl of lettuce without any of those high fructose corn syrup kinds of condiments on it. Totally different context likely gives different outcomes. So the more nuanced we can become in our understanding, the more we start to see how things are actually working, and we can get a little bit closer to understanding some of the mechanisms. So what else could we say about omega-3 fatty acid research? One of the favorite books that I've ever read about omega-3s and their potential impact is Dr. Michael Lewis's book, When Brains Collide. Dr. Lewis is a colonel in the Army, or he was. He's retired, but he's led all sorts of different trials with soldiers. He's done a lot to advance care for members of the military here in the U.S. And when he retired from the Army, he became even more interested in omega-3 fatty acid research because of cases like Randall McCloy Jr.'s. And so as he's done more and more studies, which he outlines in this book for the lay public, he talks about the finding that if you have higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids prior to an injury, it seems to correlate with less likelihood that you'll present with a concussion. For example, he did an experiment with the TCU Horned Frogs football team, where they looked at all the years on record of diagnosed rates of concussion. And then they gave the athletes during an entire season a preventive dose of 3,000 milligrams of fish oil per day. EHA and DPA combined were about 3,000 milligrams. They gave them that dose throughout the whole season. And at the end of that season, the rate of concussions that were diagnosed was about 1/4 of the rate from all of the other years. Now, some people might say, well, maybe they knew they were being studied and they held back. I'm not sure that you could argue that because they went to the championship that year. They were doing really well, having an amazing season. They were playing full out. They just didn't have as many concussive injuries. Dr. Lewis has done work like this in the military, giving soldiers preventive doses of fish oil. And that seems to correlate with a lot lower rates of diagnosed concussions. Dr. Lewis says that based on his current knowledge and experience, omega-3s should be consumed at a dose of 3 grams per day. And the FDA has reviewed that and said that is generally regarded as safe. So even in the highest dose fish oil supplements that you can find on the market today, that would be 3 capsules instead of the 1 that's listed on the label. The FDA reviewed that and said, no, that's actually considered safe for the majority of people. And there's promising research and evolving clinical experience indicating that omega-3s are useful and effective for recovery following a TBI concussion. I've even seen this in elderly people. I've had operators of assisted living communities work with residents' physicians when they've had a fall, and they've used higher dose fish oil for a week or two, and they've seen significant improvement in those residents. Anybody who's worked in assisted living or skilled nursing or memory care has had the experience of a resident who falls and almost overnight their cognition just drops dramatically. I believe that happens because a fall, even if they don't break anything, causes the brain to slosh around in the skull. We know as the brain ages, it atrophies a little bit. We know that the bony prominences inside of the skull become more pronounced. If you were to actually look inside the skull of an older person and compare it to when they were younger, you'd see that there are more rough edges. The bones have changed a little bit, and now you've got these sharper corners. And if the brain is sloshing around more in the skull, it's doing a little bit more damage. And that's causing a stronger inflammatory response. And when inflammation goes up, energy production at the cellular level tends to drop. So if an older person falls and their brain sloshes around in the skull and it ignites a stronger inflammatory response, that would explain why their cognition seems to drop. They're not producing as much energy. And if high-dose omega-3 fatty acids both help with recovery and they calm inflammation more rapidly, that might explain why, at least observationally, many people do so much better when you use high-dose omegas. So we've got to influence our fat head and recognize that DHA is the structural omega-3 in the brain. And EPA appears to have a real impact on mental health. Interestingly, EPA is especially important in the gut. And we know that 90 to 95% of our serotonin that makes us feel really good and centered and calm is actually made in the gut. Maybe there's a connection with feeding the gut more effectively with EPA and why it is that people feel better when they start taking fish oil. Anecdotally, I have seen a lot of clients who start adding higher dose fish oil into their daily regimen, and they report within 1 to 3 or 4 days feeling an uplift in their mood, along with a little bit better ability to concentrate. Why is that? I think it might have to do with the EPA connection. So what really matters when it comes to omega-3s? What do you have to look at if you're exploring a supplement? There are tons of different supplements out there. And one of the things that confounds a lot of the research out there is that there's not a ton of control over what supplement gets used and what the dosing is that they're using. We see this, for example, in vitamin D research. Some vitamin D3 research says it's phenomenal, that when you have higher levels of vitamin D3 in the blood, like between 50 and 80 nanograms per milliliter, I believe is the correct units of measurement. When you have 50 to 80, there's a dramatic risk reduction in breast cancer and cancer overall. And during COVID, we learned that people that had higher serum levels of vitamin D3 were not as likely to have severe COVID. They did a lot better. And yet you contrast that with other studies on vitamin D3 research, and their results say it was not impactful. Often the difference in those studies is the dosing. A lot of the research on D3 gives people a dose of 400 international units. I've seen clients that have to take 10,000 IUs a day or even 20,000 IUs just to get to a level of that 50 to 80 sweet spot that many functional medicine practitioners say is what would be optimal. I've seen some people that take 2,000 IUs a day to hit the sweet spot. Every body is different, And the only way that you know if you're hitting a target in blood levels is to actually measure it in the blood. So I think it's careless and a little bit irresponsible to just give everybody 400 IUs and assume that that's going to be enough and not be checking blood levels and comparing what happens in people with higher levels of D3 in the blood. The same's true with omega-3s. So when you look at a supplement, you want to look for a high concentration of EPA and DHA. And you want 50 to 60% of the total omega-3s coming from EPA and DHA. You want to look for something that's pharmaceutical grade. It's often described as molecularly distilled. Look for it in a dark container so that it's not out in sunlight, which could further oxidize the fish oil. Fish oil is easily oxidized, and you don't want to take damaged fish oil into your body. That could cause real problems. Generally, really good fish oils say that they have pro-resolving mediators. And this is what's especially important. You want to make sure that you're getting fish oil in the natural triglyceride form and not as an ethyl ester alcohol form of omega-3s. Omega-3s that are in their natural triglyceride form generally say that they're coming from smash fish, sardines, mackerel, anchovy, salmon, and herring. So let's explore what it means to have a triglyceride-based fish oil, and then we'll wrap some things up here and we'll go to Q&A. So if you squeeze a fish until oil comes out, that fish oil is in its natural triglyceride form. When you squeeze a salmon, for example, what comes out is 98% in the triglyceride form of omega-3s. There are no ethyl ester alcohol-bound omega-3s in nature. And yet on a lot of labels, you see fish oil or omega-3s as ethyl ester alcohol. Well, if you look at omega-3s in supplements, you'll see this difference. If it's triglyceride-based, you'll find it's in its natural triglyceride form. And that means it's more easily absorbed. It's also more expensive to make, and those fish oil supplements tend to cost a bit more. If you were to puncture the capsule and taste it, it tastes like you're eating fish. It doesn't taste horrific. When you take a fish oil supplement that's in its ethyl ester alcohol form, it's a lot cheaper to produce, so it's less expensive. And it's in that form because they do that to remove impurities. But you end up with a situation where greater sterility overshadows the efficacy, and it's a lot less available to the body. They're about 75% less absorbable. So why do they make ethyl ester alcohols-based fish oils? Well, you squeeze the fish to extract the triglyceride-based fish oil, but it may have impurities in it. And in order to refine it, they introduce ethanol, or an industrial alcohol, to bind up the fish oil, and then they add heat and distill the oils to remove impurities. And now they can say it's purified and it's concentrated. And then usually they coat the capsule to avoid fish burps. Why do they do that? Well, the body has never seen an ethyl ester alcohol molecule out in the natural world. Those were only introduced in about the last 20 or 30 years. And the body doesn't know exactly what to do with it. It's not fully absorbable. And for the most part, those nasty fish burps that some people get are undigested fish oil. So in order to prevent that horrible experience and keep people consuming the fish oil, they coat the capsule. But because ethyl esters are not easily absorbed, you don't get as much of a benefit from them. Absorption from the gut requires conversion back to the triglyceride form, or you can't absorb the omega-3s. So if it's an ethyl ester alcohol-based fish oil, the bottom line is you're getting poor absorbability. Now, if a manufacturer takes some other steps, they actually convert the fish oil back into its natural triglyceride form, which means it's far more bioavailable. It's a lot better absorbed. It's also more shelf stable, and you're not running as much of a risk of having damaged fish oil. So you'll see things like groups recognized here on the slide, the physician-recommended nutraceuticals. You'll see triglyceride form turned into unpurified native oil and then turned back into an omega-3 fatty acid that's triglyceride-based. I thought this was interesting from their site. They said the triglyceride form is what has actually been shown to have evidence in omega-3 fatty acid research. So that would imply if you're doing research with an ethyl ester alcohol-based fish oil, it might not show the same benefit as fish oil in the triglyceride form. Ethyl esters have been in the human food chain, they say, for about 20 years. And yet for millions of years, humans have been eating fatty acids in their natural triglyceride form. So how much omega-3 is recommended? Well, again, 3,000 milligrams a day is what the FDA said is generally regarded as safe. And yet that's a lot higher dosing than most people ever consume. And even in high-dose supplements, that might be as many as 5 capsules a day. The standard American diet is so low in omega-3 fatty acids, though, that sometimes people need a loading dose. Or in the case of traumatic brain injury, sometimes people benefit from a higher dose. Dr. Michael Lewis suggests that for the first 1 to 2 weeks after a brain injury, people might need 10,000 grams per day of combined EPA and DHA. Well, that can be like 9 or 10 capsules of some high-dose fish oil supplements. When you look at blood work, like we do here at A Mind for All Seasons for people, it's staggering to see that most Americans have 10 to 20 times more omega-6 than omega-3. And the goal is 4 to 1 or lower. And perfect would probably be about 1 to 1. Cell membranes are made up of both omega-3s and omega-6s. And you can think of omega-6s as being rigid, kind of like a pen or a pencil. And omega-3s are a little bit more like a drinking straw. They have some flexibility to them. Cell membranes have to have properties of both flexibility and rigidity. So too many omega-6 fatty acids might mean a cell membrane that's too rigid, and you're also in a pro-inflammatory state. So let's have a few examples of some of the labels out there, and then we'll wrap this up. And I'm not trying to disparage any particular brand. These are just randomly selected fish oil supplements that a lot of people will find in the store. So take it for what it's worth. This is just an exercise in reading labels. If you look at the back of a label of fish oil, you might see the little cross symbol next to fatty acids. And then if you look at the supplement facts a little bit further, it will say as ethyl esters. That means that this fish oil supplement is an ethyl ester alcohol supplement, and we don't recommend using it. It doesn't have the best results in the research. It's not as absorbable. Sometimes you'd have to take half to the entire bottle to get as much omega-3 fatty acids as you might get from a really good quality triglyceride-based high-dose fish oil. What about this one? What about krill oil? People tell me all the time, well, I take krill oil, and I've heard that that's really good. But look at the dosing. You have 60 milligrams of EPA and 30 milligrams of DHA. In a really high-dose triglyceride-based fish oil supplement, the combined DHA and EPA numbers are usually closer to 1,000. That means that this krill oil supplement is very low in the dosing. If you see Burp-less on a fish oil container, it's almost always an ethyl ester alcohol-based fish oil. And if you look at the label, it doesn't always say as ethyl ester alcohol, but you might see an ingredient like triethyl citrate. And if you go look that up, you'll find that that's related to ethyl ester alcohol. So that wouldn't be one to use. These are common fish oil supplements from the same company. And if you look at them, you might have no disclosure of the form that they're in, or it might say that it's in the triglyceride form, but the dosing might be a little bit lower than would be ideal. Or it might say that it's in the ethyl ester alcohol form, and you might look at the label, and if you get hung up on the dosing, you might say, oh, it's got a really good level of DHA and EPA. And then you recognize it's in the ethyl ester form, so it's not going to be as absorbable. You won't get as much benefit. So when you actually look at the label and you add things up, you find out it might not work, or maybe they don't even disclose which form it's in. You might see, oh, it's in the triglyceride form, but again, low dosing. And so you might need even 10 capsules of one like this just to get to that maintenance dose that Dr. Lewis talks about. You might have a label that says, as this one does, it's ethyl esters. So we're not going to use it. So out of the brands that you find on the shelf made at Costco, the one in the middle seems to be the best. It's in its triglyceride form. The biggest problem with it is that it's low dosing. So what are some of the top performers that we've seen here at Mind for All Seasons? And full disclosure, we have zero relationship with these manufacturers. I've never even talked to anyone from these companies. We've just used them, and our clients have used them with good success. And the dosing is very different than what you see on the other containers. This is not an exhaustive list. I'm just giving you some examples here. Sports Research makes the fish oil that you see pictured here. Notice they have 1,250 milligrams of omega-3s in one capsule. That's really high dosing. It's made from wild Alaskan pollock, and it's specifically listed as being in the triglyceride form. We've had good results with this. You could take 3 capsules a day of that and do really well meeting the recommended maintenance dosing that Dr. Lewis talks about. This is another one, Pro Omega 2000 from Nordic Naturals. In 2 soft gels, you're getting 2,000 milligrams of combined DHA and EPA. So if you're taking 3 capsules, you're hitting that maintenance dose. And some sources even say you should have 4,000 milligrams a day instead of 3,000 milligrams. Now, at the end of all this, you might be saying, well, what about the risk of bleeding? I've heard for years, Eric, that you want to be really careful with fish oil because it thins the blood. And your doctor's going to tell you to not take fish oil supplements prior to surgery because it will increase the risk of bleeding. Researchers have actually looked into that. There was a trial called the OPERA trial, in which they actually gave people very high doses of fish oil, something like 13,000 milligrams of fish oil for many days leading up to surgery. And then they looked at the rates of bleeding in those patients compared to those who didn't take the fish oil. What they found was pretty interesting. Higher achieved omega-3 fatty acid levels were associated with lower risk of bleeding, not higher. So they didn't know what they'd find. For all they knew, it wouldn't make a difference. But it turned out that people who had higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids in their blood actually had lower rates of bleeding. And they concluded that these findings support the need for reconsideration of current recommendations to stop fish oil or delay procedures before heart surgery. I thought that was so interesting. Having more fish oil was actually better and reduced bleeding rates during surgery. So hopefully this lays the groundwork for some questions that you might have, but I hope it also underscores the need to be very careful in looking at the headlines that are out there. Let's not have knee-jerk reactions just because a journalist says something. Very often journalists are not trained scientists, and they look at the result of a study and they infer all kinds of things that the researchers themselves would never say. Many of the researchers out there are actually pretty careful in what they say. And if you read some of their papers, they acknowledge limitations openly. They recognize some of the things that the study says and some of the things that the research cannot tell us. Often it's the media trying to report on it that spins these things out of control and causes a lot of uproar where people say, oh my goodness, I've been taking fish oil supplements for years. Am I going to have higher rates of atrial fibrillation? Well, that depends on who you're listening to. So with that, we'll wrap up the more formal presentation and let's shift to some Q&A.